I was thinking as George was setting out with relentless pessimism some of the challenges before us, that economics is the dismal science. And I'm glad that he got on at the end to some of the things that we need to be thinking about doing in terms of policy change, in terms of design, in terms of cultural shifts, in order to deal with the challenges and the opportunities that this demographic phenomenon that he's pointed out to us actually presents all of us with. And I think that we also ought to remember that the sheer ingenuity of human achievement and the way in which it has developed over our history, has actually solved many of the problems that earlier economists, earlier Georges, if we could put it that way, have presented to us in just the way he has. I'm thinking of Malthus and the fact that we're all going to starve to death because of the explosion of human populations in the 19th century. The one thing that doesn't get pointed out as we contemplate these difficulties and challenges is that we don't have crystal balls, and we don't quite know whether the opportunities before us are going to be transformed by some change in technology, by some paradigm shift that by definition we can't anticipate because it's a paradigm shift and it hasn't happened yet. So the first thing I'd want to say is that I'm an optimist about us being able to deal with all of the undoubtedly difficult issues that we're presented with. And obviously my height has presented the people who are filming this with a difficulty. That's something I get all the time, because people think that politicians are men and they're 6 foot tall. And actually we have societies, and I just wanted to comment on this. I've scribbled fertility and feminism down here, because there was some touching, and I just want to mention it in passing, although it's not obviously in my formal presentation or speech. Why is it that birth rates are the highest and at the most sustainable in what I would call the most civilized and equal societies in Europe, Scandinavia, rather than those perhaps like Italy that you'd perhaps associate, given the religious views there, with high birth rates, would actually are the lowest? Because women, when they're empowered, want to make choices. And yet the way societies have developed, with the absence of women in those positions of power and influence in the political systems in those societies, have seen an absence, except in a few notable countries, of an infrastructure that's been developed to assist them in the way in which their lives are shaped. In other words, in Scandinavian countries, in countries which I call frontier countries, New Zealand, Finland, where women got the vote 100 years ago, where they've been involved in politics much more coherently from a much earlier time, they have developed structures which take account of the shape of women's lives, which take account of the needs that women have, not only as potential mothers, but also as carers, not only for children, but for older relatives. So that actually women, if you go to Finland and you talk to women, quite a lot of women in the workforce have 2, 3, 4 children. And they haven't had to make the kind of choices that women in our society traditionally have had to make. Do I have a career or do I have a family? And the sooner we shift, partially in response to the challenges that George has set out, our societies, this is a personal view, it's sort of government policy, but it's a strong personal view. The sooner we make that shift, so we take account of the shape of women's lives, their caring responsibilities, their need for career breaks, which take away the awful choice that many women in the UK have had to make between having a career and remaining childless, or having children and having to settle for an interrupted career, perhaps with no way back, so that they can't rise to the top of their professions unless they sacrifice, so that they have to give up doing that if they've got elderly relatives to care for, so that when they then retire, they end up, in general, poorer than men. That's got to end. And one of the responses, I think, to the demographics that we're talking about has got to be that. Because if you get that right, then your fertility rates rise. And we have to look at how we can redesign our societies to take account of the needs of both genders much more effectively than we have done in the past. Now, that wasn't in my speaking notes, but I think it's really important. And I think actually, if you look at the shape of pension provision to date, the people who are most excluded from it at the moment, although this will change with crediting in 2010, are those women that don't even qualify for the basic state pension in their own right because of the requirements upon which that system was built, which were essentially Beveridge requirements of having a full-time, 40-year job, making contributions, and women's role then was to be the wife and to benefit from their husband's contributions in a time when divorce wasn't as prevalent as it is now. And we have been gradually migrating our basic structures and systems away from that Beveridge model ever since, by getting rid of the reduced married women's stamp, for example. I mean, I think we have to remember quite how far we've come, whilst admitting that we need to go a lot further. 1950s, if you were a woman who got married, you were expected to give up your job. Married women couldn't teach. I mean, I can talk to women who were in the labour force then who were expected not to work after they'd got married. We are a very long way away from that now, and in fact, it's in all our interest to make sure that those approaches are long gone and that we actually facilitate women returners and hope, as I think George said, that we can persuade people to stay in the labour market longer as they get older and that they can carry on enjoying at least some access to work in order to retain both income and meaning to their lives. So I think we are moving, because of the tipping point, this demographic change we're talking about, to a society that's going to be very different if we can sort it out that way. I agree with George that doing nothing and just allowing this shift from 1 in 8, a ratio of 1 in 8 in the 1950s of people at work to those retired, to 1 in 2 by 2050 isn't a viable model. But at the same time, just to cheer you all up, I happen to think that 50 is the new 30. You know, and the closer I get to 50, obviously, the more I think that. That's not only because our life expectancy is expanding, but I think there has been a genuine shift over time in attitudes towards age. And when Beveridge first instituted retirement pensions after the war, the whole planning and approach for that was that on average a man who retired at 65 would be dead at 66. So you were actually planning social policy for 1 year without a regular employment income. It's now regularly 20 and moving on up certainly to 25. So we're now in a circumstance where we have to plan in the DWP, all of you have to think about when you're thinking about social policy, how you want to vote, what kinds of demands you want to put into the political system to have expressed. You've got to think, well, do we really want to have a system, even if it were sustainable, where an entire third of our lives would be spent in retirement, with all of the attitudes towards the retired that we currently get? In a consumer society, the cult of youth is one that we're all used to seeing, and I'm afraid that the TV and media, it's one that they pursue the whole time, and it doesn't leave an awful lot of space. I mean, okay, we get grumpy old women and grumpy old men. We have to change those cultural attitudes. We have to recognise, I think as our society hasn't always, the experience and wisdom that can come with age. We have to recreate as well, I think, a much bigger, better sense of intergenerational solidarity than I think I see when I'm out and about now, where we have a more atomised society than we used to have when families were larger and we hadn't gone into smaller family units quite often, many people living on their own, singly. That's another big difference, where there's actually an alienation and lack of understanding between younger generations and older generations, because quite often they don't come across each other very much. And so older people think that younger people make a lot of noise and they feel threatened by them, and younger people don't really get the chance to get to know about older people if they don't have them in their own families, their own grandparents or great-grandparents. So I think that we've got a lot to do culturally and socially, as well as setting the right policy structures. And clearly George is right that migration's an issue that can have an effect. I think paradigm shifts of the sort that I've talked about with family-friendly policies and the feminism fertility issue is important, and I think that any sensible advanced society will want to make progress towards creating a different sort of settlement for women. But I also think we have to create a different settlement for older people, and that means definitely participation and allowing ongoing participation in work rather than having this the day after your 61st birthday, all of your rights to employment and the protection that comes along with it, your place in society often that comes along with it, disappear overnight. I think we've got to be much more flexible in the way that we do that. Now, there are issues about the building of new pension structures that I think we are grasping, and we've had three very important Acts of Parliament from 2004, 7 and 8, which have begun to put a new, much more flexible and important pension structure into place, which essentially says the government has particular duties to ensure that it funds basic state pension and ongoing contributions to individuals and company pension savings, but also tries to create a circumstance where we'll have auto-enrolment into pension saving for the millions of people who don't save at the moment by 2012, with personal accounts as well. And there's a range of issues in this area that I think are the right building blocks to go forwards, and that's the positive side to the increase in state retirement age that, again, George referred to. And I think that's the right framework going forwards, simply because of the realities of demography. I think we have to make certain that we keep a consensus going forwards to build and strengthen that. And I think that it's odd to say, but there are some direct comparisons with some of the other lectures and problems that you've been contemplating, probably in this lecture theatre in your series on the 21st century. I happen to think that this whole issue, pensions policy, how we move forward, is quite similar to climate change. Now, that might sound rather odd, but actually it is a re-engineering of an existing system. This is not a greenfield site. We have to re-engineer an existing system over time by engaging in thoughtful debate with the population and those who will be affected. We have to change completely the way we do things in order to make the settlements that we have sustainable into the future. This is over 30 or 40 years. This is what similarly we have to do with our policy making to prevent climate change and our new energy policies. You have to plan ahead 20 or 30 years, and you have to try, implicitly at least, to develop an intergenerational contract and an idea of intergenerational fairness that will give you the political consensus that you need to take that forwards. So I think this is quite similar in many ways, and I think the interesting thing about the 21st century is this: because the challenges are so profound, because we have to move initially from a series of societies which developed to almost exploit the possibilities of building economic growth. We now have to move from that to a much more sustainable model. And to be sustainable, it has to be more holistic in the way in which it answers questions moving forwards. And I think that's the same for our energy policy as it is for our battle to stave off disastrous climate change. And it also is in our battle to make sense of the demographic challenges that George outlined in his comments. So I don't want to bore you with the details of pensions policy. It's all there on the website if you really want to look at it. But I think that with those kinds of approaches, we will actually make the progress that we need to make. We have always to remember that education, that technological advance can shift the paradigms and give us perhaps the productivity increases we need to create a more sustainable settlement, which will deal with some of the issues that we've both been talking about with respect to age and the opportunities of having an older society before us. And I think also that we have to remember our optimism when it comes to this. All too often in these huge policy challenges, it's easy to get so worried about the doom side that you forget basic human ingenuity, the progress we've made so far, and our capacity for re-engineering and change. And it's that, I think, that I'd like to leave you with. I'm essentially an optimist, and I think that we will develop a more balanced, richer, in many ways culturally richer settlement moving forwards because of the successes in extending life expectancy, which we have managed to achieve to date. And let's face it, the challenges that we're talking about today have come about because of a great success of civilization, which is that we have been able, by our own efforts, humankind has been able to extend life expectancies and therefore give us these difficulties to contemplate. And I think we should set off looking at these challenges from that optimistic view in the knowledge that we will be able to solve these issues in a good and civilized way if we contemplate them properly and discuss them properly, and I think that we will.